So if nothing else, you can see that working with this group, we do enjoy working with each other. So it's pretty cool. So I'm Broderick Crawford, and I'm going to start my story. I'm the executive director of the NBC Community Development Corporation. The reason why that's important is because my organization was started by my church, which is New Bethel Church, because of our desire to be more involved in the community. And I'm going to try to get through this now that the picture's up without being emotional. My why is that young man that's in the middle of that picture. So that is my dad. My dad is now 89 years young. He was diagnosed with prostate cancer at the age of 78. So at the age of 78, the options that were available to him were very limited because of, and part of in my bio, what I talk about is getting minorities more involved in research and clinical trials and helping to decrease and diffuse the distrust or lack of trust that minorities have with not only the clinical trials, but how do they advocate for themselves. If my dad would have been tested probably 50 years earlier, his current treatment plan and his current quality of life would be much better. And so although I look at my dad now, and in that picture, that was this past Labor Day, as you can see, he's a pretty happy fellow. He's in a wheelchair, he's blind, he has prostate cancer, he has a tube in his bladder, and he can't walk. But yet, if he were to roll in here right now today, you would not see any of that other than the wheelchair because he doesn't carry that with him. He believes that he is helping others. My good friend Steve Henson, who was here when he had one of his earlier meetings at Gilda's Club, my dad insisted, even though he had just had a treatment, that he wanted to be there. And so it was important, and it is important for him to be able to share his story. And so through me, I'm able to help my dad share his story and help minorities understand the value. And then as you look at that picture, the two young men on the left of that picture are my two sons. The young man in the middle with the little boy is my nephew, my youngest brother's son. And then that's his son, and as you see, he has his hand on my shoulder. And so there you have 4 generations, and I want to see, my why is I want to see all 4 of those generations live as long as my dad has. And so that's why I do the work that I do, and it's often a struggle even within my own family. So I have 2 brothers, and neither one of them wanted to get a DRE, digital rectal exam, because they say that's an exit, not an entrance. But knowing that my dad is a prostate cancer survivor, it's important for me to help them understand the importance of that. Having worked in the medical community for a number of years, I'm okay with it and I'm comfortable with it. I chose a physician that had small hands, but there's a reason for that. But hey, that's what you have to think
You
about.
and my husband.
Indeed. And so again, this is the journey that I've had now. I've had the opportunity to advocate for minority communities. I've recently, in addition to being part of Pivot, I've also now part of what's called a RIC, which is a Recruitment Innovation Center, which is hosted out of Meharry Medical Center, or Meharry Medical College and Vanderbilt University. I can't talk for some reason here. And so with those 2 campuses, we are now engaging with folks all over the country in increasing minority participation in clinical trials with a focus on cancer. Also a part of the 10, which is a Trial Innovation Network, which Kim is here as a part of Frontiers. There are 60 centers around the country now that are trying to intentionally engage community in clinical trials, and what does that look like? So oftentimes, that was shared with 2 of the earlier presenters, you have all the clinical and the scientific, but what does it actually mean for a person in a community, at a church, at a community center, at a barbershop, at a beauty shop, when you talk about cancer? Because most often in my community, that's a taboo word. It's not something, and folks run from it. But how do we embrace it in a way that it could be helpful and create better patient outcomes for all of our residents? And so how do you talk about your neighbor? Michelle and I were just talking here about what I did for Thanksgiving. Well, I happened to spend my Thanksgiving to a very dear friend, a couple of mine, and both of them were cancer survivors. And one of them, the young lady now doesn't wear hair anymore because she wears it with pride that she's lost her hair. And she looks good without her hair. But how do we embrace that and help our community remove some of those stereotypes that exist when it comes to cancer treatment and what might happen to you with cancer treatment? I'm going to tell on my folks now. As my dad was going through his therapy, he would ask me for a certain pill so that he could be more active. And then, so he would ask me for the pill, and then my mom would tell me not to give it. It's like, look, hold on. I don't need to be in y'all's bedroom. But again, that was real for him because he was not able to perform in the way in which he had previously. And so his treatment impacted that or affected that in a way in which he wasn't happy. Now, how many times is that often talked about with couples outside of the bedroom? Not frequently. So how do we create a space for that to be talked about comfortably and in a way with dignity? And so again, as I go through this process, I'm fortunate enough to now serve on 2 community advisory boards, 4 community advisory boards advocating for those with colorectal cancer, one with genetics, and then one with infectious diseases, specifically with HPV. And so how do we begin to give that voice to individuals who are living with those particular diseases? Again, I mentioned Steve and the Prostate Network and the great work that he's doing, again, trying to reach out to men because, as he and I both agree, men just don't seem to be the first ones at the plate when it comes to just regular medical treatment. And then when you add cancer to it, if it isn't for their wives, their daughters, their sisters, play such a vital role in helping them understand the importance of A, getting diagnosed, B, then getting treatment, and C, following the therapy plan. Because oftentimes they'll do 1 and 2, but I'm tired of this. Someone mentioned the 24-hour jug. Pfft, not happening. I'm not even doing a 1-hour jug. Okay? And so, but helping them to understand, my dad, if any one of his 5 daughters ask him to do something, he'll do it in a heartbeat. If I ask him, then I get to look. So again, even more so than my mom, my sisters have greater influence on him. So helping men to walk through wherever that influence is to help them get to a point of a good patient outcome. And then I will close it with, a lot of times we don't understand the value of meeting people where they are. So oftentimes, particularly with minority communities, they don't come to this facility. Mm-hmm. They won't come to a facility like this. We know that 80% of our health doesn't happen in a hospital and a clinic. So why are we spending 90% of our dollars on the 20%? That's backwards. And so hopefully in some of the work that we do, we can help change that narrative. We can help understand that where we need to meet people is where they are. Is it the grocery store? Is it the barbershop? Is it the church? Is it the nail salon, plug for Kim? We need to meet people where they are and then be willing to talk to them in a way that they can receive it where they are. Because they don't want to hear all the scientific jargon. What happened? What can I do? And how is it going to affect me in the future? Thank you.
So even without slides, you're awesome, Broderick. So thank you. And again, my bad for not telling him to have slides. And I have none, but I took all of your words from our first exercise this morning, and I made a Wordle for you, a word cloud. Those are all the words you used. The bigger the word, the more often it was mentioned. So look at what's in the middle. I'm Kim Kimenow. I'm part of Pivot, but I come to Pivot as a researcher. And you've heard these great research advocates talk about how they've plugged into advancing research. I just want to flip it a little bit and tell you that I'm a researcher trying to train other researchers to be listening to your experiences. So I'm actually trained as an anthropologist. I study how people behave. Joy's like, what? Yeah, so I study about sort of how people behave and how they develop a culture of how they think and behave and kind of operate. And the world of cancer research is its own culture. It has its own language, as you know. It has typically is driven very much by the clinical interaction, by physicians and the clinical team in treatment. And that group often kind of forgets that A, they have their own culture and world and language. I'm here to point it out that they do. But they also have never been trained really on how to interact with you as someone who's got a lived experience with cancer. It's not their training. It's not their background. And so for a lot of clinicians, they'll say, when I say, how do you engage patients? They're like, I engage them every day. I've got one in 5 minutes. Or 5 minutes, right? They think that their routine clinical care and visiting with you during a regular routine visit is fine. There's nothing broken from their perspective. They're doing what they need to do. And sometimes they forget to ask questions. They forget to pause. They forget to leave room for family members who may want to ask that question, like Broderick said, maybe separate from the patient to help that patient. They sometimes need awareness building to be more open to engage. So that's just on the clinical side. But on the research side, folks like Danny and others and Jen that you heard today, even for them, it's hard for them to learn how to do research differently. So what I bring, and my colleague Jill, who's in the back, who's a nurse researcher, both of us are trying to train the research community on how to accept you as a partner on the team. Just as much as you need to build your confidence to be a member of that team, they need to figure out how to play nicely in the sandbox with you. How do they need to adjust the way they think about research and really, really carefully listen? 90% of this, folks, is just how to listen. And it's not that anybody intends not to. Nobody's bad-hearted here and doesn't want to listen to patients or moms or spouses or sons and daughters. But we get lost in a lack of that focus. So as a researcher, that's my job. What we're trying to do is build the community of researchers who are ready to work with you. Because I'll tell you, most of you are more ready than they are. They need a lot of help from you. And they need you, as Cheryl said, to be asking questions, just that constant question asking. You may feel like you're being annoying, but you're not. It's just so crucial. Because I may not have the answer today, but boy, Cheryl's question is going to make me think about it tomorrow and the way I go forward in my research. So number one, it's a journey for researchers too. That's one point. My second point is that is really to underscore Broderick's point, and that is, as an anthropologist, my focus is bringing in the most vulnerable among us, folks who don't have health insurance, folks who live out in those rural and frontier counties where there isn't a specialist. There's not the treatment that they need, where there are what are called disparities, right? Simply by the fact that you live in Garden City or Satana or wherever, you don't have access to the same care and the same physicians. So the Cancer Center is working really hard to push ourselves out and support every Kansan, no matter where they live, every Missourian in our catchment area, to make sure that everybody gets access to this. So not only do we want access for care and treatment and opportunities to be engaged in research, we want to also make it, just like our great folks on Zoom here, to connect to us without physically having to be here as patient voices. We think it's really important for us to hear from patients across the area. So Michelle and Peggy dial in every time we have a meeting from Wichita. So I said, this is the first time I've met Michelle in person, but we've known each other for 2 years. Same as Kim, yeah. So we connect just using our computers, just using our phones. So there's all different ways for you to connect, and Hope's going to talk about connection and how, if you're interested, if we've dangled something of interest to you out there today, how you can get interested from where you are right now. We want to meet you where you are right now, and how you want to be involved, if at all, in Pivot is our next step to hear from you. So before we go there, we're going to talk to the panel, kind of open it up for questions, and I'm going to ask a few questions for them to react to and give you a little bit more background on how each of them took their journey into research advocacy. Okay? So the first question I'm going to ask is, how much did you guys kind of feel like you knew about science or needed to know about science before you became a patient research advocate? Michelle?
Before I became a patient research advocate, I'm a registered nurse, but I'm a cardiology nurse. And when they said I had cancer, that was like so out of my league. And then when they said I had anal cancer, that was way out of my league. And there was very little data about it. So I really didn't know very much about it. It was kind of a learn as you go, but I was really interested in doing it. So when they said, do you want to get involved, that first SPORE meeting I went to, I'm like, sure. I listened to them and learned from them, and they in turn listened to me, because I was the expert at being the patient. So that's really the great thing, is to know all the nuts and bolts about squamous cell carcinoma and HPV and blah. I know a lot about it now, but in the beginning I did not. What I did bring was I knew everything they didn't, because I had the cancer. So that is what really, really helped me to be involved. That I didn't really have to know a ton about the research and the science and the basics to get involved. I kind of learned as I went.
So I would like to answer the first question because, I'm trained as a medical technologist. So I had a lot of scientific background, worked in infectious diseases here at KU, so RNA and DNA and those types of things were very common and comfortable for me. But it's amazing because as I began my journey as an advocate, none of that mattered. What mattered was, because in my case it was my dad, and interacting with my dad, all of those technical scientific terms meant nothing. Here I have my father, who I love dearly, who is now suffering, in my opinion, needlessly because of the lack of access that he had to care. And so for me, being an advocate had nothing to do with science. It had everything to do with what's right for us all. And my dad deserves to have the best care possible. And I'll share another quick story. I have two friends. Again, I went to KU, joined a fraternity, and I have two of the guys in my pledge class that both were diagnosed with prostate cancer. One is a civil engineer in Washington, D.C., and the other one was basically self-employed in St. Louis. Well, my friend in St. Louis recently passed, and my friend in D.C. is alive and well. And I believe that the reason for that is because the gentleman in D.C. had great insurance and could get access to all types of care and treatment plans, and the gentleman in St. Louis was on state Medicaid. And so the options were not available to him. So in my opinion, advocacy is also making sure that because what you do or don't have should not dictate whether or not you get the best care available.
Yeah, here, everybody's seconding that. Sure, can I ask you a different question?
I don't know. It's whether I like the question or not.
Well, I get
Told you this is a fun group here.
So the question I want to ask Cheryl, because you saw that slide with a gazillion acronyms of her roadmap, like that scares the lights out of me. Like she had pivot up there in one corner, but then she had Komen, she had different colors, she had this long pathway of getting involved. So I'm going to ask you, how much time would I need to dedicate to being a patient research advocate? It looks like you've done so much over so many years. Does everybody need to look like you in that roadmap? Or where did you start and kind of how did it grow? Tell me about
Well,
that.
They do need to look like you.
no, they don't need to look like me. Although that wouldn't be bad. Seriously, I'm a research geek, or at least it turns out that. I just love to learn. And so obviously I've made this sort of a life calling, and I put an awful lot of time into it and an awful lot of attention and love and work into it. But it's as much as you have time for. So maybe all you want to do is participate in a focus group here or there, or work with a given researcher, or one of the things I do is serve on the institutional review board for the National Cancer Institute. So I review with scientists trials that are getting ready to be introduced, and we looked at the informed consent, and we look at the documents and the protocol and what is being asked of the patients from a patient's safety, understanding, and reasonableness standpoint. So that's something else you could choose to do. That takes me like every 2 Thursdays. Every other Thursday, I participate in that meeting. So anyway, it can be as much or as little. And initially when I got involved, it was as a grant reviewer, and so that was once a year, where it was intensive during that one period where you'd have like anywhere from 8 to 10 grants that you were the primary advocate reviewer on, but generally what they ask advocates to review is the impact statement, how does this affect patients, and the lay abstract and how patients have been involved in the design of the work. But then there's some of us like me who like to be overachievers, and if there's a list of things to review, we'll try to review it too. But again, we don't know the science, so we can't really talk about the science, but we can say, that didn't really make sense from a patient standpoint. Is that really valid? So it's, again, asking questions. But that doesn't take as much time. And then, of course, learning about science, learning about how cells work, learning how cancer evolves has always been fun for me. So you could just choose to do that. Again, it's all about what you want, what you have time and commitment to do and passion to do. So that's why I said that's 22 years, and it doesn't have everything on it, but it's 22 years, and I admit, I'm in type A when it comes to doing this kind of thing. So please, you don't have to use me as a judge for what you need to do, because that's not what you do. Whatever it is, it's going to be damn good. So any contribution you make is what needs to be made.
A great question from the audience. So you heard that 2 of our research advocates both have a background in something to do with health. Michelle is a nurse, and Broderick is a medical tech, and so they had a background in health or health care. Cheryl, what's your background? Are you a nurse or a healthcare person?
No, but I am an honorary member of the nursing alumni for the school. Doesn't count. Anyhow, I'm a CPA by background and training. I had a lot of my paid work was in healthcare. So I was a healthcare executive and a hospital association executive, and at one time I was a Chamber of Commerce executive. So my background is not health. I did not know anything about health. And when I first raised my hand to do the reviews for Komen, that was back in the days before we had computers, so I got this huge box of research grants with all this terminology that wasn't even in my medical dictionary, and I didn't have anything to look up online. So I had to read those things from sort of a perspective of, does this make sense to me? And keeping in mind what a professor once told me and said, if you can't explain what the dynamics of this are to the clients you serve, you don't know it well enough. So you've got to be able to explain what you're trying to do and what you want them to do in language they can understand. So that's kind of the way I took it. If you can't explain to me in the impact statement and the lay statement what this is about in the way I can understand it, then you must not know it well enough. So, but really what it is all about is they don't understand how much they don't use common everyday language. So that's, again, where we come in to help them get reconnected with their native language, assuming they are English, and some of them aren't. So that can even be challenging. But one of the first young researchers I got to work with was from China, and she had a really thick accent. So trying to understand what she was saying from that standpoint, as well as the terminology. But just by asking questions and conversing back and forth, we were able to present her poster in layman terms, such that when we got ready to present it, she would step back and let me explain to everybody that came up what it was. Because one, she was more of an introvert, and two, they didn't have to worry about, and she didn't have to worry about whether they really are understanding them. And she was just beaming with what we had created.
Let me just move this down to Broderick.
Broderick. gotta move too.
Broderick, could you talk a little bit, I just want to stay on this theme. So how much training have you gotten to be sort of who you are in research advocacy? Did you take a course, you got a minor, what's your?
It's a real easy number, 0.
Nobody can train you.
That's another fact. Again, I told you, we love each other. So no, I received no formal training, and again, this is part of why Pivot is being created, to be able to develop a vehicle to look at what's needed, what's necessary, and so I've just learned as I went, working with different researchers, trying to help understand, and often I happen to also serve as the director of our health ministry at my church, and my pastor would say, you need to go see someone at KU or Shining Mission, and just trying to talk. The one thing I did have in common was the ability to talk and interact with physicians, providers, nurses. So that I could do. But as far as understanding the nuances with each of these individuals and what they were going through, I had no clue. Even with my dad, I did not understand what he was going through and the things that he was dealing with on a day in, day out basis. And so I had to learn to ask questions. And that's really the thing that if I can encourage all of you all to do is be willing to ask questions. We've heard this 1,000 times, there is no dumb question. Ask questions and challenge them. One of the things I try to share with people is physicians and nurse practitioners and providers are people too. And so they can miss it. They can miss it. And they can misrepresent what they're trying to convey. They could have all the great intentions of the world, but if you don't understand it, it means nothing. So it's very key to ask questions, and that's what I've learned and been willing to do is ask. It doesn't matter to me who you are, how many letters you have behind your name. If I don't understand it, I need to know, because you're trying to do this to my dad. And before you put one needle in, one drug in, I'm going to understand what it is, why you're giving it to it, and what's the purpose for it. Don't tell me, well, no, then you're not going to move in here. And be willing to take that stand. That no, you're not putting one needle in this IV till we understand what it is. And be willing to do that. And particularly in the evening. Particularly in the evening and overnight. Because those folks, God bless them, come in, they're ready to roll, they're ready to move, because they are short-staffed. It's not their fault, they're short-staffed. So they're coming and moving, they ain't got time to talk to you about that. Particularly 2 o'clock in the morning. So I'm real good for being in here late, or wherever it needs to be. Because I want to make sure that my dad gets the best care he can have 24/7. Exactly right. So Hope just made the point, that's exactly what we're asking of researchers. So as they're on those clinical trials, I want to understand why they're taking this. So why is he getting the placebo versus the actual medication? Is at the end of the trial, those that are getting placebos, will they get the actual medication? So I understand the need to have balance, but I want to make sure that with that balance, there's also treatment for those who did not get the actual drug. If it's effective, then we need to make sure that everybody is going to get it.
Great. Michelle?
I want to say okay, he used the term placebo. If you're talking about a cancer clinical trial, it's generally not a placebo, it's the standard of care. So you are
Correct.
getting the standard of care, which is what we best know how to treat it right now, versus this new idea. So nobody receives no treatment unless it's one of those where there's no treatment available right now.
Correct.
And there are some of those, so.
Thank you.
And I really want to add to that, because when I was at the SPORE committee meeting, one of the things they talked about with cervical cancer was doing the standard treatment, but then adding this immunotherapy. And then how did they think the patients would receive that? And I stood right up and I said, if I knew I was getting what everyone was going to get, and then I was going to get maybe this thing that might be a booster to me, I would sign right up. If they told me I was going to get immunotherapy, they don't know what's going to happen, and then these other people are going to get standard treatment, I might be a little reluctant. So they cared what we thought about that. They cared about if they thought that they could recruit enough people to get a simple blood test Would men want to know if they have HPV? Do you think we can recruit enough men into this study to get this blood test to see if we can detect it before it's turned to cancer and possibly maybe pre-treat them or prevent them from infecting others? Is it really interesting? You know, and I thought, yeah, I would do it, but that's coming from my perspective as a survivor of an HPV cancer. Well, if there's an immunization floating out there right now, folks, and they've just raised the age limit to 46. I mean, I'm telling everybody, go get that thing.
When we talk about human papillomavirus, HPV, we often think of it in terms of cervical cancer because that's the most common cancer that results from this virus. Okay, but when you tell guys about HPV, like including my sons, they were uninterested in the shot. Like they had a choice with a mom like me, they were going to get it anyway. But I wanted them to be informed. And then when I told them that it was penile cancer prevented, they were really, really interested. You know, cancer of the penis is not something any guy wants to really think about. So that made it a whole lot more real. So I don't think I scared them. I was just sharing information. I want to talk a little bit about diversity, both diversity of cancer types, because there are so many, right? We're all like Tigger. You know, there's one of this and one of this and one of this in our group. You know, Tigger from Winnie the Pooh, you know, he always says he's the only one. Lots of diversity in the type of cancer and its course. Lots of diversity in the treatment of cancer. Lots of variation in where you get that care, how soon in your journey you're getting care, but also where you come from. So if you don't speak English as a first language, if you're a mom with a highly vulnerable young child who has a cancer, if you're from a community that frequently is uninsured and doesn't have resources, how do we make sure that we bring those voices to the table as well? Because sometimes the voices we hear are the loudest voices. They're the most confident voices, and you hear confidence up here. These three are just amazingly confident. They've grown their confidence over time. They've made a commitment to be a voice, but they're pretty amazing, I think. How do you help someone who's got a quieter voice, who's got a younger voice, who's got a voice that speaks a different language? And I want to talk to this group about their advice for us keeping that bigger picture of cancer experience at the table. So Michelle, what are some of your thoughts about bringing the most vulnerable among us? We're all vulnerable in dealing with cancer, but particular populations who have a challenging time in accessing health care or cancer care. What are some of your ideas on how to be welcoming to that group as well? And then obviously, Broderick, I know you could talk for half an hour about this, but I want you to share.
I was kind of thinking Broderick was the expert on this one, but I mean, for me, at least where it started for me was when I was told that I had anal cancer, I immediately felt shame and stigma. For what reason, I do not know, because everybody gets HPV.
Everybody has an anus.
Everyone has an anus too. But it just seemed I had a lot of shame and stigma immediately. And you know, as a healthcare provider, I recognized that. And it silenced me, I know it's going to be hard to believe, for about 30 seconds. And then I decided that I was going to step through that, because I knew that if I felt that way, that everybody felt that way for no good reason. And so I made a choice to step through that. And as I had connected with other women across the country, I call them my sorority sisters, my virtual sorority sisters, they were all women like me, happily married, a lot of them had kids, they all thought they had a hemorrhoid, they all ignored it for months. These were people we had something in common, but they felt silenced because in their community they were embarrassed. These weren't things that they were going to talk about. So for me, that's where I drew a lot of my inspiration, because clearly I'm not shy. So I feel like I bring a voice for the stigmatized. I'm not going to speak for what Broderick, he's bringing a voice in a different way, but the stigmatized cancers have a very difficult time raising their voice. And I think when they see me raising mine, when I interact with them, I encourage them to not be afraid, that it's okay to step into the light, because I will tell you this, if I had been diagnosed with stage 1 anal cancer, I might have quietly received my treatments, told people I had bowel cancer instead, and just walked on superstar. That's not how it was for me. I had metastasis in my spinal column. I didn't have a lot of time left on the earth. Well, so they said. And, you know, I use this as an opportunity. I didn't have time to be afraid, but I did understand all the emotions that everybody was having. And I think that that's as we interact with people, we can say, yes, I know how you feel. I was afraid too. I was worried too. This is how I overcame that. And if they don't feel like they have to raise their voice, they have me. And I'll be their voice, and they can tell me, and I'll do it for them. Because, you know, there's no shame, and some people will never be able to do that. I think by y'all being here, you're interested in using your voice to help other people. And to think about yourself as being a voice for people that feel like they cannot speak is very powerful. Take it away, Broderick, because take it away, my man.
So I'll answer that in a couple different ways. So one, the single most critical way that I would say that we address vulnerable populations is that we all have to communicate. So we are well beyond the time when one group, one person, one organization, one church can solve anything. If we don't learn to band together, then we will continue to fail. So I want you to think for a moment. If all of this group in this room were to go out this door and walk down 39th Street, what would happen? There would be all sorts of people wanting to know what's going on. What are they doing? Is it a rally? Is it a this? Is it a that? Think about that when we look at cancer. If we all rally together, many voices become heard when a single voice can be drowned out. Okay? Second piece that I would address is not only as you look at ethnicity and diversity and even rural areas. I was recently in Garden City, Kansas, and what was interesting is that there, and I rode the bus, well, I rode the train there and then rode the bus within the city. And what was interesting to me is that when that bus went to Target and went to Walmart, you heard when you got to Target and Walmart. But yet when it stopped by the Finney County Health Department or the Genesis Federally Qualified Health Center, FQHC, you heard nothing. So here we have an opportunity to do what they're already doing. Doesn't take a rocket science for him to say, we're at Finney County Health Department. For those of you who may need health services, this is the place you might be able to get that. Hello? Again, many of the solutions are not real, and it didn't cost him anything to do that. Didn't cost anything. So too often we think about some of the solutions are tied to money when it's actually simple communication. And so the thing that I would say that I would share with you is that think about how we communicate, whether we communicate verbally, with our bodies, or with our time. The more that we can express ourselves in great numbers, collaboration and partnership matters. No matter what cancer it is, I won't allow another person that has the same cancer that either of these two young ladies had without sharing it. Even though it's not my cancer, this is my team. And so I can't see any member of my team getting anything less than the best. And the more that we can do that, the more that we can eradicate these cancers that are killing us today.
You want me to answer the same question?
Yeah, from your perspective.
Well, let me understand the question. How do we involve the vulnerable populations in research advocacy?
And diversity.
How do we make sure that we're really bringing the biggest circle of voices together?
In research advocacy. So it's problematic. We've been struggling with this in a lot of different issues. And starting Pivot, we were very intentional in trying to get a diverse group of patient leaders to work with us. And that meant looking different kinds of cancer, different stages of cancer, different cancer experiences, different geography, different races, ethnicity. And it was hard because, like, I don't necessarily have the connections I need to maybe reach out to Broderick's community. So that's where we really do have to do a better job as advocates and reaching out to other advocates in other communities to bring them into the fold, and they can then bring others into the fold of being involved in research advocacy. And Broderick talked earlier about really stressing with the African American community, particularly males, the importance of clinical trials and the importance of research and getting involved in this and doing it in baby steps. But it's actually meeting everybody where they are and giving everyone the space and the opportunity to have their voices heard. And at this table, that's our goal, is to have it as open and diverse as possible so that we can get the best cancer research care for our entire community.
Great, thanks. So a couple of other responses, we just have a few more minutes, to some of your questions. I'm going to take the liberty as moderator to address a few of those and then ask the team to jump in if they want to. One question was about Pivot's ability to help support patients when they get the first news about cancer. The emotional needs of patients and families from the very beginning of hearing that diagnosis all the way through the journey. And so that's a topic that the KU Cancer Center is very focused on. What Pivot can help do is navigate those patients and families to the resources that are available. We're here as cancer survivors, and obviously for some, sharing that experience and being a support is something they're willing to do. But that's not a requirement of Pivot. What we hope to do is to be kind of a one-stop shop that helps connect those with needs to the resources that the Cancer Center has. And we've got really amazing navigators and support for cancer care. Hope's given me a wrinkled forehead. Have I missed something? No, okay. So that's one thing.
Expressions, Hope.
Yeah, well, I'm an anthropologist. I'm reading the face.
Yeah, I can.
Second was access to care for those with limited insurance who just can't pay for this. This is a topic that if we ask Cheryl about, she'll talk for another 30 minutes, so we won't. But it's called financial toxicity. The cost of care, the cost to your family, the cost, literally the dollars for ongoing care and services is enormous for some people, for many people. And so access to even screening to detect cancer, if you can't pay for the screening tests, may be a barrier for vulnerable populations. So we need to keep bringing our voice up about bringing everyone, as Broderick said so well, everyone should be able to access the same quality care, regardless of where they live, what color their skin is, or what language they speak. So it clearly is one of our organizing principles to keep this top of mind. And then the last point was asking about advocacy, sort of capital C, capital R, big cancer research advocacy, when we know our federal government dictates a lot of what gets researched, right? We chase the money as researchers as well as chase our passion for particular kinds of research, and those things kind of have to collide for our research careers to continue. The advocacy for bigger funding, more focus, is something that is not a primary activity of Pivot, but we obviously connect you to others that really take front and center stage for that. Our focus is much more on the patient experience in our area and helping bring that voice to the research happening in our area. But we're not expecting you to carry that banner to get us more National Institutes of Health funding or National Cancer Institute funding. We'd be glad for you to support candidates and do anything you think is appropriate for supporting cancer research, but that's not our primary focus. Our focus is on research advocacy instead of overall advocacy. Does that make sense? Good, nodding heads, perfect. Hope, I'm gonna turn it over to you unless there's any other.
I think.
Yep.
So was this fantastic?
Yes.